Welcome learners to this lecture on George Eliot's Middlemarch. In the previous lecture, we discussed in detail the characterization of Dorothea Brooke and Tertius Lydgate and some of the issues raised in books 1 and 2, especially vis-a-vis the institution of marriage. In this module, we will be looking at books 3 and 4. Book 3 is titled Waiting for Death and book 4 discusses 3 love problems. Now, if you look at this novel, some of the themes, and one or two of them we have already discussed, is institution of marriage. We have already discussed it in terms of Dorothea's choice of her marriage partner vis-a-vis Edward Casaubon. We've also discussed Lydgate's attraction towards Rosamund Vincy. Another theme that's important in this novel is about the social and political description, in a sense, of the times. And we see Middlemarch, a manufacturing town with a burgeoning middle class. We have characters like Will Ladislaw, who are, in a sense, Lydgate, who are coming from outside. Will Ladislaw, of course, is also connected, in a sense, to the society. There is a lot of discussion of estates, wills. So that also gives us, in a sense, an insight into the legal world, really speaking, of the times. We have a slice of history in terms of, how it is a manufacturing town. We also have, of course, deep insight into the political backdrop. There is the field of medicine. Reform then is at the level of the political, medical, and the social. Now, the issue of marriage, already discussed, is going to be developed further in this lecture, and we will also be able to see at close quarters the way in which the wave of change was affecting the social structure. The entry of Ladislaw into Middlemarch society being a case in point. So, if you look at Ladislaw, you also, as I said, keep in mind what he represents and how is it and why is it that his presence in Middlemarch, in a sense, is also seen as unsettling the established relations, social relations, established equations, in a sense, in society. At the same time, when we see somebody like Lydgate with his plans for the future and so on, and we discussed his spots of commonness. And another insight, really speaking, there is, remember his relationship with Laurie, something that has been that's mentioned in the novel, and how he's completely scandalized that Laurie claims that she actually wanted to accidentally kill her husband and she tells Lydgate that of course you're a good young man, but I do not like husbands. I will never have another. So for him to even understand this is something that's beyond his frame of mind, and there is something that George Eliot, really speaking, is making a point about the way in which patriarchy is structured and the way in which roles are really speaking styled and gendered in society. So such was Lydgate's plan of his future, to do small good work for Middlemarch and great work for the world. Now, if we look at the financial world into which we are placed, really speaking, in the 19th century. So we have an important character here, Mr. Bulstrode. And Mr. Bulstrode's power is not simply because of his being a country banker who knew the financial secrets, not simply because of his being a country banker who knew the financial secrets of the traders, but it was also, as is mentioned in the novel, fortified by a beneficence that was at once ready and severe. Ready to confer obligations and severe in watching the result. In a sense, he's shrewd, he has his aims, and he sees them, really speaking, to the end. So, if you look at the idea of reform that Lydgate brings in, and Lydgate and Bulstrode at some point, are associated, in a sense, by the society with each other, and you have people like Mr. Chichely who say, hang your reform. There's no greater humbug in the world. You never hear of a reform, but it means some trick to put in new men. I hope you are not one of the Lancet's men. Now, this reference, in a sense, this is a reference to Lydgate's new plans. The way in which Lydgate is looking at, setting up the fever hospital and so on. And so he says that, well, Mr. Chichili says that, well, let's hope you're not, and Lancet is the journal, that the medical journal, it's a reference to that. So, and if you look at Lydgate and, the fact, as was mentioned earlier, also about the way in which he's completely charmed by Rosamond Vincy. And he says, and I quote from the novel, "How an accomplished woman almost always knows more than we men, though her knowledge is of a different sort. I'm sure you could teach me 1,000 things, as an exquisite bird could teach a bear, if there were any common language between them. Happily, there is a common language between women and men, and so the bears can get taught." So, this is a point that you need to think about. Is there something common between Lydgate and Rosamond Vincy? That is what you need to ask. Or is it a relationship between bears and birds? Or is there a language that is common? Is she really able to understand Lydgate, and is Lydgate able to understand her? So, if Rosamond is to be the accomplished woman, how does all this affect Lydgate and his great plans of reform? What is his initial plan? His initial plan is that he could not marry yet. He wished not to marry for several years so that he could dedicatedly devote himself, in a sense, towards the medical reform that he had started out for. Yet at the same time, this notion of being in love with a girl that he happened to admire is something that draws him in. And so, and here I would like you to pay attention to George Eliot and the way in which the narrator is also kind of, creating these characters, creating a situation, and is standing outside the situation and practically laughing at these characters. So you have George Eliot saying, and I'm quoting from the novel, "Poor Lydgate, or shall I say, poor Rosamond. Each lived in a world of which the other knew nothing. It had not occurred to Lydgate that he had been a subject of eager meditation to Rosamond, who had neither any reason for throwing her marriage into distant perspective, nor any pathological studies to divert her mind from that ruminating habit, that inward repetition of looks, words and phrases, which makes a larger part in the lives of most girls." So Rosamond Vincy is presented to us in terms of, the conventional mold of the way in which an accomplished woman is there. And, the looks, words, phrases, all the stereotypes are being used here. And Lydgate, who has a lofty conception of what he wants to do, has no clue about how he is going to succumb to what is not a stereotypical character, but a stereotypical institution. And it's very interesting. George Eliot, of course, as you know from the first two modules, led a very, very different life. She led a life on her own terms, and she lived, in a sense, a life that one can call of freedom. She writes a novel when she's a mature woman, and she's looking back in time and is able to depict these characters with great confidence. But apart from characterization, she's also throwing at us the limitations of the institution of marriage, and at the same time bringing in a very important aspect, something that was not considered or valued in the 19th century, which is that of compatibility. So, I also mentioned about how Lydgate and Bulstrode. Now, to be associated with Bulstrode is advantageous only to a certain point, the advantage being of setting up the fever hospital. But Bulstrode has his own wild ways also, and so Lydgate's association with Bulstrode is going to become very, very problematic for him later in the novel. So, now, when it came to, the reason they come together is that when it came to the point of voting for the chaplain to the infirmary, and it so happened that Lydgate's vote became very important, he voted like Bulstrode for Mr. Tyke. Whereas really speaking, he wanted to vote for the other candidate, that's Fairbrother. So, Lydgate later is able to establish himself as a doctor as he treats, and it's not as if he does not have the potential. It's not as if he does not have the capability and the finesse that is required, really speaking, of a doctor. He has that. And it's important how the 19th century, of course, is very, very important, when it comes to developments in the field of science and medicine. So, he establishes himself as a doctor as he treats Fred Vincy, and much, of course, to the annoyance of, Dr. Wrench. In all this, of course, Rosamond has fancy notions about him, not just being a doctor, but being related to a family of nobility. So she's actually more charmed by that aspect, whereas that aspect, really speaking, is probably the redundant aspect of Lydgate's life. So she charms him with the reading of writers, and most of them are romance novels, and all these names have no meaning, really speaking, for the medical man. And here, if you take a look at this particular excerpt from the text, if you read this carefully, you realize that the George Eliot is, through this particular moment, she's making us think about Rosamond Vincy. Was it by chance that at this moment she gets very close to Lydgate, or was it by design? So we don't know this. So after sitting 2 long moments, and you can take, as I said, a close look at this quotation. When he rose, he was very near to a lovely little face that he had been used to seeing, turning about under the most perfect management of self-contented grace. But as he raised his eyes, he saw a certain helpless quivering which touched him and made him look at Rosamond with a questioning flash. And at this moment, she was as natural as she had ever been when she was 5 years old. So this in a sense draws our attention to the gradual closeness that develops between Rosamond Vincy and Lydgate, but something that, as I said, the narrator continually undercuts. And this undercutting, really speaking, makes us look at both the relationships, the Dorothea Brooke, Edward Casaubon, and the Lydgate Rosamond Vincy relationship in a very, very objective manner, true to the art of a realist novel, something that is very, very significant, really speaking, in the 19th century. So, since we are mentioning Dorothea and Casaubon, what happens to Dorothea after marriage? It is only a continual decline. So much so that, she's disappointed, she's completely disillusioned. And I quote from the novel, "I'm sorry to add that she was sobbing bitterly with such abandonment to this relief of an oppressed heart." Yet, Dorothea had no distinctly shapen grievance that she could state. So she has probably not realized why it is that she's upset. But immediately after marriage, the entire visit to Rome, really speaking, is not something that turns out to be the way she wants it to. The mental act that she was, that was struggling forth into clearness was a self-accusing cry. She had married the man of her choice, and with the advantage of most girls, that she had contemplated her marriage chiefly as the beginning of new duties. So the very idea that marriage is actually a duty, marriage is not an institution to be enjoyed, but it is something that is a duty, leads her to a choice that is a very, very insipid one, and it dulls her life. So his key to mythologies is also a disappointment, and it's an unrealistic work that would probably fetch nothing. And gradually, as Dorothea Brooke realizes that this is not going to be what she had imagined it to be, her relationship with Edward Casaubon, in terms of reading out, writing, making notes, trying to learn new languages, almost as if she was going to embark on this new academic journey and a new project, in a sense, is something that comes to naught. The duties of a married life, contemplated as so great beforehand, seem to be shrinking with the furniture and the white vapor-walled landscape. This idea of duty and marriage, and something I think George Eliot particularly she's drawing our attention, because this is not only what Dorothea Brooke, really speaking, thinks about, but this is also what is set out, really speaking, in society for women, that marriage is also, in a sense, a set of duties that a woman is expected to perform. So Dorothea Brooke And of course, when she decides to marry Edward Casaubon, she imagines these duties to be different. These are not going to be the duties of, let's say, what Celia is going to follow in her marriage to Sir James Chatham. So we see that, everything seems to be shrinking. The world seems to be shrinking to her. The expanse, this expansion and contraction, the expansion being her design, her theoretical idea of what marriage is going to be, and that contraction of realizing that this is actually speaking nothing is a poignant realization. It's very interesting that we see this idea of marriage being discussed in a lot of other novels of the 19th century. We have Balzac's Old Goriot, French writer. We also have Flaubert, another French writer, and Madame Bovary. In that too, this idea of expansion and contraction is used quite often. So much so that finally she blurts it out, though of course she reins herself in, almost as if self-censoring. But there is a moment when she has this outburst and she says, you showed me, and I quote from the novel, you showed me the rows of notebooks. You have often spoken of them. You have often said that they wanted digesting. But I never heard you speak of the writing that is to be published. Those were very simple facts, and my judgment went no farther. I only begged you to let me be of some good to you. Whereas, what is Edward Casaubon really thinking all this while? Do we have an insight into his mind is the next question. And I think that is very, very important, because here, I would just bring in Terry Eagleton, who, in the book The English Novel, has devoted a full chapter to George Eliot. And about Middlemarch, he says, Casaubon in Middlemarch is a bloodless old pedant who speaks like a legal treatise and dies of a fatty degeneration of the heart, a phrase almost calculated to inspire the reader to place a small asterisk in the margin and write symbol beside it. But just as we are about to write him off, the novelist steps in to remind us that Casaubon too has a palpitating inward life which should win our respect. But just as we are about to write him off, the novelist steps in to remind us that Casaubon too has a palpitating inward life which should win our respect. So Eagleton is making a very important point here about the narrative technique. On the one hand, George Eliot takes us through Dorothea Brooke and makes us look at the world through her. And we are very, very critical by this point, when she realizes that the world around her is shrinking. We are very critical of Edward Casaubon. And yet suddenly, at the same time, George Eliot also provides us an insight into Casaubon's mind. Now, this is a very important aspect of a realist novel, because the writer writes objectively. The writer does not pick sides with any of the characters, but the writer, it's descriptive. The technique is descriptive. It shows you, describes to you how these characters are placed. So Eagleton's intervention here is very, very important. So we understand how the narrative technique is such that, in a realist novel, it provides us an insight into all the characters and not just, its chief protagonists. Take a look here at this picture. This is Dorothea and Will Ladislaw. And here is a picture with Rosamond and Tertius Lydgate. Right. So if Lydgate is really speaking the man of modern medicine, then the new impulses also come from Ladislaw. And in one we see, in a sense, the physiological organism coming together with the sociological. In another, we see the sparks of a new wave of thinking that ranges from art and aesthetics to political journalism. So, social and political reform is what Ladislaw will bring in. So, whereas Lydgate is going to focus more on medical reform. The wedding journey, that is the journey that is undertaken by Dorothea Brooke and Edward Casaubon to Rome, is meant to reinforce her relationship with Casaubon. But actually, it only ends up creating a dent, and it is into this little space that we have Will Ladislaw making an entry. And really speaking, the trip that was supposed to reinforce this relationship is, of course, unable to do so. So as we move from the old and the young, really speaking, to waiting for death, we need to ask whose death and what does death signal in the novel. So there is Casaubon, there is Peter Featherstone, both headed towards death. And in fact, this book, really speaking, ends with the death of Featherstone and a decline in the health of Casaubon. And this decline also indicates a certain morbidity, really speaking, in the Dorothea-Casaubon relationship. And we know that with Peter Featherstone's death, the will, really speaking, does not leave anything much to Fred Vincy. At the same time, a family that we have not discussed so far is the Garth family, which is very, very important. So there's Caleb Garth and his daughter Mary Garth, and Fred Vincy is in love with Mary, but Mary is very disillusioned with him, for he's not really speaking doing any work. He's supposed to join the clergy, but he's not cut out to be part of the clergy. So, and of course, Featherstone has these two wills, and when he wants to kind of destroy one particular will, and Mary is unable to, Mary refuses to do so. She really later questions herself about the same. So, we must keep in mind the fact that in the world of Middlemarch, the idealism that we have seen so far is not rooted in reality, neither Dorothea's nor Lydgate's. And so, if her understanding of self-marriage and spouse is faulty, equally faulty is Casaubon's understanding both of marriage and of his own work. In the case of Lydgate too, there is this problem. Virginia Woolf, of course, called this a novel for grown-up people, and one must mark how it brings out not only this lack of compatibility in marriage, but a complete lack of sexuality in the Dorothea-Casaubon relationship. And how the Dorothea-Ladislaw relationship is infused with these overtones, so much so that the sterility in one is totally contrasted with vigor in the other, something that threatens Casaubon's patriarchal space. And of course, it is therefore no surprise that he does not want Ladislaw in the vicinity. And where we see critics like Elaine Showalter have referred to George Eliot as a feminine novelist who foregrounds the concerns of women, Gilbert and Gubar, who have focused on the anxiety of authorship, the use of the male pseudonym, but have also drawn attention to the mad woman, the character in the attic. But here, when we see Dorothea, she's not the character in the attic. She's the one who has not realized herself completely. And this aspect is very important in understanding George Eliot as a novelist. I think that is this complete, aversion in a sense to a realization of the physical space is something that's very important here. So this, of course, brings us also in a sense to the significant parallel plot, or do we want to call it a subplot, which is that of the Garths, the Vincys and the Bulstrodes in a sense of Middlemarch. So the true metal of provincial life then is to be seen in the Garth family. On the one hand is the irresponsible attitude, as I mentioned, of Fred Vincy, whose financial loss has repercussions for Mrs. Garth. The whole episode of the horse, really speaking, has repercussions for Mrs. Garth and Mary. Both of them lose their money. But at the same time, this is contrasted with the moral uprightness and hard work represented by the entire Garth family. Right from Caleb Garth to Mary Garth, Mrs. Garth, they're working very hard. And in fact, to quote Malashri Lal here, she says that domestic scenes such as the one in which Mrs. Garth is, she's cooking, testing her children in grammar, and she's taking care of the family, she's also teaching. So all this, self-centeredness has no room here. And as Mary belongs to the lower rungs of society, George Eliot is telling us that integrity and idealism can be personal attributes separate from class. This is a very important point, that when we are talking of integrity and idealism, the higher you go up, probably the integrity and idealism is really speaking going down. So, is, and I quote here, "Yes, Mr. Garth, I came to tell you something that I'm afraid will give you a bad opinion of me." And this is Fred Vincy, right? He says that I can't find the money to meet the bill after all. And this is where, they undergo a financial loss. So, and Mary Garth she does not spare words. She says, "I should be ashamed to say that I loved a man who must always be hanging on others." And it's probably because of this push that Fred Vincy is really speaking able to do something. And so who is Dorothea Brooke to Edward Casaubon? Who is Dorothea Brooke to Casaubon? Is she like a helpmate, a secretary? But Dorothea could not be just this, because she had a mind, a thinking mind, and she had the potential of probably doing a lot more, which is why she asks him and questions him about the work he is doing. But as Lydgate tells Dorothea, bringing all the characters into new relations, that Edward Casaubon is not going to live for very long, because he's suffering from this fatty degeneration of the heart and would probably live for 15 years. And this is probably going to convert Dorothea Brooke into almost somebody who's just going to nurse and take care of Edward Casaubon. Of course, he dies before that. So the end of the third book, really speaking, brings us back to the world of inheritance and wills with the death of Mr. Featherstone, where one bequeaths some money to Fred, the other leaves him, rather unattended, diverting all to, the illegitimate son, that's Joshua Riggs. And this, of course, also creates an air of mystery in the novel, where the outsiders are coming within Middlemarch to stake a claim, so to say. And who is this outsider? You need to think about the way in which the novel is constructed. But it also tells us about how in these provincial lives, the lawyers also have a very important role to play. So, and to quote Terry Eagleton here, Eagleton says, "The novelist here then is a kind of social scientist, exploring through the lens of her fiction the microscopic processes by which character and circumstance interact. The realist novel is a kind of imaginative sociology," and this is a very interesting phrase, imaginative sociology, because the world that she depicts is the world before 1832, before the Reform Bill is passed. And it is imaginative because this is fiction, so one which can forage beneath external facts to lay bare the inner recesses of human consciousness. It is thus a diagnostic social knowledge rather than a descriptive one. So, I would, however, say that it is both diagnostic and descriptive, because we must remember that the realist novel is primarily descriptive in the sense that it shows you, through its diagnostic understanding, it shows you the way in which society is structured. So, the three love problems take us back to the complex world of relationships. There's Dorothea and Edward Casaubon, there is Lydgate and Rosamond, and there is Fred and Mary. And in fact, the Dorothea Casaubon relationship is actually, really speaking, the love problem is more Dorothea Ladislaw. So, and in each, the social, the economic context is very, very different. So in the first two, vis-a-vis, of course, Casaubon, then Lydgate and Rosamond, we see, how idealism plays a certain role. And then in the third one, it is through Mary. So there is this element of idealism, there is real life, and there is a society of a certain kind. So the entry of Ladislaw disturbs the Dorothea Casaubon relationship. If we look at Lydgate, Lydgate wanted to lead a simple life. His profession had familiarized him with all grades of poverty, and he cared much for those who suffered hardships, but he's not able to do that, and he spends a lot of money kind of doing up the house the way in which Rosamond Vincy wanted it. So the doubt hinted by Mr. Vincy whether it were only the general elections or the end of the world that was coming on, now that George IV was dead, the Parliament dissolved, Wellington and Peel generally depreciated, and the new king, apologetic, was a feeble type. So this is an instance of history that is thrown in, and many such instances that you will find, really speaking, in the novel. And who is Will Ladislaw in all of this? He is described almost like a Shelley, right? That he's the one who's going to bring in the political reform, really speaking. This Shelleyan figure who begins writing articles, much as, of course, we know that Casaubon has forbidden him to come to, Lowick, that's estate. But, it is Mr. Brooke who actually takes him in. And because he's bought the Pioneer, he starts writing articles for the same. So, how does then Dorothea relate to all this? How does Dorothea relate to Aunt Julia and Ladislaw's mother, both women who had left their families? How is it that Dorothea relates to these women? What does the novel then say about the construction of women characters like Dorothea? So, in Middlemarch, really speaking, and Jennifer Judge, I'm quoting a critic here, says that Eliot subverts a pivotal gendered assumption of the 19th century evolutionary physiological psychology that women's minds are prone to, more than men, prone to passive forms of, instinctive forms of habit. And what she says is, and she bears it out, that if you look at the characterization of these women, they are all stepping outside their zones of habit in certain ways. I mean, Rosamund Vincy is also not that, the provincial prototype. Neither is Dorothea. They're all moving outside it. And they all want to expand their chances, their horizons in the world. So, the routine belittlement of women and accompanying aggrandizement of men is exposed to be destructive, mental and moral habit, right? So the novel, really speaking, is equally critical of, the men, in the air over here. So in this lecture, we basically discussed different aspects of life in Middlemarch, and we discussed, the way in which characters are placed within the institution of marriage and the limitations of each one of them, the idea of the different kinds of love problems, the idea of the characterization of women, and above all, the most important aspect being that of the narrative technique. These, viewers, are some important aspects that you need to keep in mind while analyzing Middlemarch. Thank you.